Welcome back. Now let's follow this story to its bloody conclusion. Several centuries after Aranosh's death, another priest of Quellius would make the journey to Dagnor's Cauldron. Lord Frederick Willhaven was yet another goody-two-shoes priest of Quellius. He was so inspired by the tales of Aranosh's legacy that he made a pilgrimage across the sea to find the ruins of his temple. Along with his very understanding wife, Lady Anna, his eldest Maria, his son Gaston, and his young daughter Sarah. After months of searching, they eventually found the remains of the long-lost chapel. Upon discovering the holy site, Frederick declared that he would not only follow in Aranosh's footsteps, but would do one better by bringing both peace and culture to the Cauldron. It's important to note that Lord Frederick was not only a priest, but a noble as well, something that was reflected as he began designing plans for the new estate. A modest temple wouldn't be enough to accomplish his goals, thus he commissioned an entire manor, including a ballroom, chapel, infirmary, library, main dining room, and all the other luxuries modern civility had produced. He also included a tap room in his designs, believing that alcohol would be an excellent way to soothe tempers. The manor was built with the family chapel constructed directly on the foundations of Aranosh's original chapel, inheriting the same protections that had guarded the previous priest. A hedge maze, gazebo, food garden, gazing pools, and meditation chambers were also added for the comfort of the guests. Once this truly massive undertaking was complete, the Willhavens proudly christened it the Kindly Estate. All were welcomed to visit the estate and heal, or give up their violent ways and stay. Frederick's first success was a troll named Stonebite, who agreed to a more peaceful life and took a job as a bartender of the tap room. Stonebite was both charismatic and intelligent, surprising many of the guests who chatted with him. If he'd survived, perhaps he would have served as an ambassador for the estate. Instead, his rotting corpse still guards the tap room to this very day, torn between the urge to serve living visitors a drink, as he did in life, or tear into their flesh. In an effort to inspire peace between the races of Fadwer, Frederick was known to throw extravagant parties with generous amounts of music, food, and drinks. If the stories are to be believed, orcs and goblins danced alongside elves and dwarves in his grand ballroom. The Kindly Estate was truly a miracle on Norrath, an oasis of tranquility in a world consumed with strife, and perhaps the only place where one could be judged by their character rather than their race. As we all know, where there is light, there will inevitably be a darkness hungry to snuff it out. Now here's the part we've all been waiting for. A lich named Tentragon glared at this miracle from the shadows. Its blessed presence burned hatred into his every bone. See, Tentragon had big plans, and the first step was getting a base of operations. He wanted a defensible position somewhere out of the way, without being completely isolated from a fresh source of nearby victims to turn undead. One of the most tragic stories in Norrath's history was primarily motivated by real estate. Getting to kill a few holy followers in the process was just a signing bonus. The Kindly Estate was just what he was looking for in a lair, except there were a few things keeping him from simply walking in and claiming it for himself. First, there were the knights to contend with. A group of 7 human and erudite paladins, led by their captain, Torklar Battlemaster, were dedicated to protecting the estate, and had easily fought off his small horde of undead numerous times. Second was the terrain. The defensible position that Tentragon wanted so badly made it difficult to approach. Surrounded on 3 sides by naturally steep cliffs, and with a 10-foot-tall guarded wall protecting the only entrance, this peaceful sanctuary was impressively fortified. Last, but certainly not least of his worries, was the fact that he couldn't physically enter the estate grounds due to a talisman called the Hearthstone of Gentle Dissuasion. It had been created by Aranosh himself, and was buried with him, sanctifying the very grounds of the Kindly Estate. The Hearthstone, just as its name would suggest, turned away any heart that bore ill will towards the estate or its caretakers. Even though his withered heart was probably preserved in a phylactery somewhere, the Hearthstone sensed his murderous intent, and each time he approached the estate, it dissuaded him. Gently. Thus the clever bag of bones came up with a plan. If his heart wouldn't do, well, he'd just have to find one that would. Now here's where that crazed dwarf we all know and love comes into the story. The Lich fell upon a lone traveler named Garanol, evicted his spirit, and took his body for himself. By his own admission, Garanol wasn't a perfect dwarf by any means, but he wasn't a killer, and he certainly didn't harbor any desire to harm those at the estate. And it was the intent of Garanol's heart that the Hearthstone read. So when Tintragen approached the estate in his fancy new meat puppet, pleading that he was injured and in need of aid, he was carried in by Frederick's well-meaning clerics, while his murderous intent went undetected. In their blind mercy, they had unknowingly brought their own death in through the front door. Tintragen waited for nightfall before creeping out of the infirmary, steering his stolen body to the family wing, where the Willhavens slept soundly in their beds, believing that nothing could harm them on their sanctified ground. Only Frederick himself was awake, praying in the chapel when he was butchered by the Lich. A permanently wet bloodstain marks where the priest died in front of the altar of his goddess. He was the first to die that night, but he was not the last. Tintragen then gleefully slaughtered the rest of his family one by one and performed atrocious rituals on their bodies before dragging their severed heads into the chapel, further staining the walls with their blood, ensuring the holy grounds were thoroughly desecrated. With Frederick's death and the desecration of Quellius's altar, the wards of the Hearthstone weakened, allowing Tintragen's forces to flood into the manor to massacre the rest of the residents. The cries of her followers alerted Quellius, who looked down to see her murdered priest, her tainted chapel, and undead forces rushing in to finish off the rest of her faithful. At the eye of this carnage, she spotted the dwarf that seemed to be running the show. To say she was angry does not do justice to describe her wrath, for in an act that defied the very aspect she represented, she killed Garanol instantly, and found his death wasn't nearly enough to soothe her rage. For this atrocity, she cursed his very soul to remain on the bloodied ground for all time, never able to leave, pass on, or rest. After driving off the undead long enough for her followers to bury the fallen and abandon the estate, she withdrew her blessing from the profane land, leaving it to the evils that had been sown there. Under the influence of Quellius's curse, Garanol's corpse rose again with Tintragen still inside. He'd already been dead long before her hissy fit, and it was Garanol's soul that was trapped at the estate, not his own, so the goddess's curse didn't really inconvenience him. Once he was back in his own body, he would be at full strength, and with his new base of operations, he could sweep across all of Fadewar if he so desired. But the Lich neglected to account for one factor in his scheming, the legendary anger of dwarves. Garanol had been a lawful soul at heart, and watching his body being used for such nefarious purposes sickened him. Worse yet, he was now doomed to suffer all eternity for a crime that he hadn't committed. He might have been a cursed spirit, but he wasn't going to take this slight laying, standing, floating, whatever. He couldn't return to his body while Tintragen was occupying it, but he found he could dominate Tintragen's weaker-willed servants to his bidding. When the Lich went to recover his true body, he found it was no longer where he'd left it. Garanol's new forces had taken it and hidden it away somewhere in the estate, trapping Tintragen in a far weaker vessel. The two continue to wage war across the estate to this very day, the Lich looking for his real body so he can get on with his afterlife, and Garanol's ghost whose sole duty is to troll Tintragen until he has enough proof to show Quellius that he was innocent. The story doesn't end just yet. Garanol was the only one doomed to suffer Quellius's wrath, and for a time, he and the Lich were the lone occupants of the abandoned manor. That is, until several decades ago. Just as Frederick was drawn to the place from its sacred legacy, a dark elf necromancer known only as the Grim... The Grim? Really? Frickin' edgelord? The Grim had heard rumors of this wretched estate and traveled there himself to see if it lived up to its dreaded reputation. This traitorous Tyrdal had turned from the hateful embrace of Inaruk and converted to the faceless one, Kazakh Thul. Seeing the terror fostered at the estate, he decided it would be the perfect place to dedicate to his chosen god for the fear it might bring. The Grim dug up all the bodies in the graveyard, save for Aranosh himself, as the weakened Hearthstone that he was buried with still had enough force to turn him away, and reanimated them as zombies. Some say you can still see the tragic figure of Anna Wilhaven wandering the grounds as a festering hag. The Grim then sacrificed himself in the chapel, not only desecrating it a second time, but consecrating it to the Faceless One. Kazakh Thul was pleased beyond compare by this, enough that he decided to alter and strengthen Quellius's lingering curse. With his terrifying touch, it expanded. The curse now acted as a beacon to wretched and evil creatures, actively drawing them to the estate. The grounds became swallowed by perpetual shadows and gripped by an unnatural cold that persists no matter the time of year. Those who approach the manor with any shred of goodness in their hearts will feel the utter wrongness of it immediately. As a final touch, Kazakh Thul ensured the curse meant only for Garanol would now be shared by all. For anyone that dies at the estate would now be trapped there just like him, forced to rise and wander restlessly for all eternity. Thus it became known as the Estate of Unrest. The curse continues to slowly creep out into the Cauldron, yet Quellius is still so angered by the events that took place there that she refuses to review them, or even stand in the way of Kazakh Thul. The rotting manor still stands at the edge of the Cauldron, calling out to the evils of the world, beckoning them to join it. Despite the risk of having their very soul fall victim to the curse, adventurers continue to make the trek out to the old estate, as legends say that the many items of power that were entrusted to Frederick's care are still hidden within the Black Vault. Not all who go to this wretched place return, and those who do will forever be haunted by the shifting shadows, biting cold, and tortured wails of the Estate of Unrest.